Hello and welcome to the Black Ponderer. I'm Neil Trotter, and that's Black Ponderer, capital B, L-A-C-K. Black referring to my African American identity. And what we're going to be talking about today is just an elaboration on why I call myself the Black Ponderer, why I call this show, this YouTube channel, the Black Ponderer. And the reason why that is I think the issue of race and identifiers like race, the issue of racism, is a huge problem. I believe that this issue is blocking human advancement, human progress. I do believe that, and I think what we need to really focus on is how do we solve this issue. I think the solution can be derived using philosophy. This is a philosophical problem. It really is. But I get comments from time to time that have it a little confused, the situation, and I want to elaborate. I want to talk about how can we use philosophy to address this profound issue. And we're going to do that by having a discussion about this book right here. It's called Nobody, and it's by Marc, Lamont Hill. This is a great book right here. We're focusing in on current affairs, and the subtitle for this book is Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond. And we're talking about the issues regarding police brutality, class inequality, that you're starting to see more and more due to social media and the fact that everybody's filming everything, and the fact that we have politics, particularly in America, but all throughout the world, that are really bringing these issues toward the surface. And it's come to a point where we really do need to start confronting these issues and addressing them, and not just ignore them. Right? We need to talk about these things, and we have to talk about them intelligently. Okay, we have to talk about them philosophically. These are philosophical problems. So the first thing you have to understand is that it's not correct to be dismissive, to ignore the issue, or to think it's not relevant, or that it's not something that's a part of reality. Let me give you some quotes. There's a little drizzle right now. It's a little bit of rain. Fortunately, I came prepared. I got a little umbrella. There we go. Let me read you this quote number 1. The racial disparities here are quite stark. African Americans make up roughly 30% of the American population, but 36% of the 2.2 million Americans incarcerated today. Roughly 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 34 is now in prison. As impressive a statistic as this is, it does not account for those who have just been released from prison, or those who, caught in persecutors' tangled web, are almost surely on their way there. Nor does it account for those who are on probation or parole. Factors that more than triple the number of black men affected to somewhere around 6 million. These numbers are so staggering that they lead to the tragic assumption that far more likely than not, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Freddie Gray would have ended up behind bars, not because they were inherently criminal, but simply because they were born black and male. Blacks under Jim Crow could neither vote nor serve on juries. They were legally denied education, employment, and housing. The same can be said today of the convict, even when the crime committed is nonviolent. Maybe even a victimless crime, like drug possession, even when she has served her time in prison, paid her debt to society, and is now officially an ex-con. And even when she exercised no bad judgment, other than admitting to a crime, perhaps under pressure from an overzealous and over-empowered persecutor. While there may be 2.2 million people in American prisons today, that number triples again when we consider those whose felony convictions have resulted in disenfranchisement, creating a dent in our democratic process. The trend toward incarcerating more African Americans is matched by the trend toward incarcerating more Latinos, the trend toward incarcerating more women, more than 200,000 in jails and prisons, and at present up to 646% since 1980, and a trend toward incarcerating more new immigrants. The number of women of all races behind bars has increased almost 20% in the last 5 years, and While the number of youth in custody has gone down from a peak of 105,000 in 1997 to 54,000 today, the number of youth being tried as adults remains high. It's a simple dynamic. Gather up all the unwanted, unnecessary peoples, anyone who possess a threat to the commanding social order, to the hyper-individualism of our market-driven times, anyone whose very presence might force us to consider a shared public responsibility or expansion of the social safety net, and put them in a cage where they will be invisible to the rest of us. We do not want to know that the vulnerable exist. So it's important to understand that race is a factor. It is a tool, something that is used to disenfranchise. And I want to bring that to people's attention. I really do want to show people that this is a social problem. And part of understanding that it is a social problem is actually admitting that it is and get out of this denial. What happens, and as I delve deeper into philosophy, what I'm starting to figure out what's going on is that people live in different realities. There are multiple realities, and this is where we're getting into more philosophy here. People are living in multiple realities, okay? And a reality does not have to be true, okay? It can be a social construct. It could be something that's made up. It could be fictional. But just because it's fictional doesn't mean that it has no effect, no influence, no power. Just because something is not true does not mean that it is powerless. So you can't just dismiss something or not acknowledge something or say that something's not important if it's based off of falsehood. Something like race is inherently false, like the concept, the idea of race in relation to human beings is a false construct, but it has huge influence and is really doing damage to human progress. And so we need to address this issue. We need to acknowledge that it exists, and we need to use philosophy to solve this issue. Let's move on to our next quote. Looks like I could put the umbrella away for now. The law is but a mere social construction, an artifact of our social, economic, political, and cultural conditions. The law represents only one kind of truth, often an unsatisfying truth, and ultimately not the truest of truths. The rush of public emotion that spilled into the streets after the killing of Michael Brown alerted the world to the existence of a multitude of other competing truths. Whatever the facts may have shown in this instance, including the forensic evidence and the parade of witnesses who recanted earlier statements, Michael Brown's life was taken with disturbingly casual ease. This indifference unmoored racial and class antagonisms long held in awkward restraint. So for those who might not be aware, Michael Brown is one of the infamous killings that happened by a police officer. It's just one of several that was recorded by somebody's camera on their cell phone. And it brought up a lot of racial tension, a lot of American politics and racial divides in America that have always existed but are now becoming more popularized. Contemporary understandings of racism cannot be reduced to intentional acts of bigotry, beliefs in biological determinism, or even subconscious prejudices. Instead, we must rely on a thicker analysis, one that accounts for the structural, psychological, and cultural dimensions of racism. With regard to Darren Wilson, even if he held no personal racial animus, Darren Wilson is the police officer, the white American police officer that killed Michael Brown, the African American victim in this situation. He nonetheless approached Michael Brown carrying a particular set of assumptions about the world. Like everyone else's, Wilson's assumptions, including socially constructed narratives about black men, Ferguson residents, and even what constituted a lethal threat. Beyond the level of the personal, Wilson also obediently and uncritically followed the protocol of a system already engineered to target, exploit, and criminalize the black, the brown, the queer, the trans, the immigrant, and the young. So it's more than just like intentional racism. You know, you can argue back and forth, and people are doing this to this day, that these officers that are killing these African American victims unnecessarily are inherently racist. This argument is not really as important or doesn't really address the true issue, and that issue is that racism and other types of social discrimination like homophobia or classism or xenophobia, these things are so ingrained in American society, so interwoven, that people are acting on its influence, the influence of these social constructs without even being fully aware that they exist. And how do we become aware of these things? We use philosophy. That's how we do it. But first we have to admit that the problem exists. And we have to acknowledge it, and we have to acknowledge its complexity. Okay? And this is why I call myself the Black Ponder, because I'm trying to bring these issues to the surface. And I'm trying to address these issues with philosophical answers. Brown's story is a testament to how race and class, as well as other factors like gender, sexuality, citizenship, and ability status, conspire to create a dual set of realities in 21st century America. For the powerful, justice is a right. This is why the discourse of race is at once indispensable and insufficient when telling the story of Ferguson and other sites of state-sanctioned violence against black bodies. Michael Brown, Tamar Rice, Jordan Davis, and Trayvon Martin. These are all recent victims of police brutality. Were not killed simply because they were black, although it is entirely reasonable to presume that they would still be alive if they were white. They were killed because they belonged to a disposable class for which one of the strongest correlates is being black. While it is hard to imagine that Brown would be dead if he were white, his death was only made more certain because he was young, male, urban, poor, subject to the kinds of legal and social definitions that devalue life and compromise justice. His physical presence on Canfield Drive was due not only to his own personal experiences and choices, but also a deeply rooted set of policy decisions, institutional arrangements, and power dynamics that made Ferguson and Canfield spaces of civic vulnerability. There's no formal poll tax to march against anymore, no segregation of the lunch counter, but the kind of injustice that the story of Ferguson illuminates is just as insidious as the targets of earlier battles of the freedom struggle. So what's being discussed right here is that the idea that really what's going on is, it's not as simple as just racism, or even when you say homophobia or, class discrimination, social economic class discrimination. This issue is a lot more complex. All of these issues are interwoven together. And that's this concept known as intersectionality. What's going on is that is this complex web of social realities that have been implemented into society for a long period of time, built upon, developed throughout American history. And these social constructs together are interwoven, and they block certain people from advancing, or they create these roadblocks. So you would think, like, okay, if we just enforce laws fairly, equally to everybody, that would solve a lot of issues. Like if we didn't have these false constructs, these type of issues wouldn't exist. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Let me elaborate with another quote. Without question, crime would be reduced if all laws were strictly enforced to the letter. For example, reckless driving would be minimal if state troopers were to strictly enforce the speed limit on the nation's highways, and loitering would cease if every gathering of teenagers on a corner resulted in a citation. Society, however, would never tolerate such rigorous enforcement in all neighborhoods. Instead, there would likely be cries that America had turned into a police state. But in many places, mostly poor and mostly black, this has been precisely the consequence. So what's going on is that the law is enforced unequally. Some areas are police states, and these police states, these communities, these areas are composed predominantly of the poor, the black, the brown, the queer, the trans. And that needs to be acknowledged. We have to acknowledge this. An approach that cures one ailment but creates another, even more debilitating one, is not a cure at all. Sure, mass incarceration has an impact on crime. How could it not? Similarly, a mandatory highway speed limit of 20 miles per hour would have a dramatic impact on car accidents, and a ban on the sale of fatty foods would have a dramatic impact on heart disease. Still, we would never institute such measures. Our respect for liberty is, at least in the abstract, too great. Why then have we been so willing to construct a prison system that denies freedom, destroys families, shrinks democratic participation, fails to rehabilitate, and decreases the life opportunities of our most vulnerable citizens? So what's being discussed here is this idea that, in general, crime has gone down. It has gone down, but it has gone down at the expense of this unequal law enforcement on people of color, on queer people, on trans people, on poor people. So at what cost? Crime is going down, but at the expense of human progress as a whole. So intersectionality is this idea that we have all these false constructs, false realities that, they're not based on truth, but they have serious power behind them. They have extreme power and the ability to oppress. There's this issue that happened fairly recently where lead was discovered in the water supply of a city, an American city, and as a result, many people of color, poor people, they were exposed to lead poisoning for years. But lead poisoning is but an extravagant example of a far more fundamental and unwieldy set of structural problems. It would be too simplistic to merely attribute Flint's current condition to corruption, incompetence, indifference, or outright racial animus. Though all these things are certainly factors, instead we must examine the ways in which many American citizens have lived in a state of economic emergency for decades. Since long before the leaves broke in New Orleans or the water was poisoned in Flint, these cities have been plagued by an increasingly contradictory set of economic relations, shifting modes of production, and a yawning gap between America's have-gots and have-nots. And that's what's going on. These false constructs, these false realities are being implemented to separate certain people, keep people away from other people, and to push aside the vulnerable. Let's look at some more quotes to continue this examination of how false realities are implemented and supported and institutionalized. Another casualty within the current framework is the truth itself. Instead of determining what actually happened in a particular case, a court case, the prosecutor and defendant engage in fact bargaining, a process by which they agree to a version of events that corresponds to the sentencing guidelines and garners a mutually agreed upon punishment. As a result, we often never find out what actually happened in a particular case. Before presenting their offers to frighten, confuse, and intimidate defendants, prosecutors are likely to work from nothing more than a few notes dashed off by the arresting officer, with almost no consideration given to the defendant's version of events. And here we're talking about, how most court cases in America are actually, they don't follow the full court process. People settle in court. Right, and a lot of that happens behind closed doors, and there's a lot of secret deliberation that happens that never gets revealed to the public. And this is how false realities or the truth gets hidden away, and how people are able to come up with these ideas about how, ultimately race doesn't matter, you can overcome through your own merits, pick yourself up from your bootstraps. That type of ideology is created by things like our court system, where most things are just settled in court and they never fully go through the whole judicial process. But this is not merely an abstract intellectual argument about the pitfalls of free market fundamentalism and its logics. We must ponder the practical consequences of a legal system so obsessed with efficiency that it does not even pretend to be interested in locating truth. We must consider the danger and corruption that inevitably accompanies a system that engages in backroom dealing 97% of the time. We must reassess a system that usurps arbitrary power from judges only to give it to prosecutors. The institution of false realities at the expense of truth. Let me read you this other quote. Despite the fact that police brutality has become a popular grievance of a large segment of our society, particularly black, brown, and poor folk, many Americans remain unaware of this reality. This is due to the nature of settlements, which end lawsuits before the issues can be adjudicated, leaving the public in the dark as to what actually occurred. The conditions of the settlements prohibit the recipient from disclosing information to the news media or making any public pronouncement on the public conduct that prompted the payout, like the arrangements struck by prosecutors with criminal defendants on plea bargains. Police brutality is a business negotiation resolved through deal-making, contracts essentially drafted in the impenetrable shadows. So we have to be aware of what's going on. It's very important to understand that these social constructs do exist. They are a thing, and just because they're based off of falseness or falsehood does not mean that they're making a difference or they're enforcing power to keep people down. Okay, that's very important to understand. You have to understand that things like blackness or other social identifiers like gender, like social economic class, these things actually matter, whether or not they are built on falsehood or not. Actually, it's really because they're built off of falsehood. And we need to give these social constructs this way of blocking human progress. We really need to think about these things philosophically. That's very important. Okay, this is that when we start to do that, then we can address a lot of issues that are preventing human beings from advancing. Okay, that's what philosophy can be used as, a tool for that. But we got to get out of this denial, and we got to start focusing on true issues, current issues. I would encourage you to read this book. Check it out. Nobody by Marc Lamont Hill, for a good examination of current affairs, what's going on in America and, the world for that matter, in terms of racial disparities, class disparities. If you want to get a better idea of what's going on, if you question why I call myself the Black Ponderer, I encourage you to read that book, and maybe you'll get a better understanding. Well, you've been listening to the Black Ponderer. That's BLACK. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.